Hello everyone and welcome back to my kitchen. For today's recipe, we're going to be making pumpkin empanadas. Fall is one of my favorite seasons because that's when you can start making all these delicious baked goods and warm drinks. These pumpkin empanadas are the perfect way to kick off this fall season. You are absolutely going to fall in love with this recipe. They are super moist, soft, and just plain delicious. Before we get started with the recipe, I'd like to take the time to invite you to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on future recipes. To get started, we're going to need 7 ounces of Piloncillo or half a cup of brown sugar, 2 sticks of cinnamon, and 3 whole cloves. Add those 3 ingredients to 4 cups of water. Place it on the burner on high heat for a good 15 minutes or until the Piloncillo is completely dissolved and the cinnamon is nice and fragrant. Meanwhile, we're going to prepare the pumpkin. We're going to start by removing the stem, then we're going to cut it in half, and we're going to scrape out all the seeds and the vines. You can discard of the seeds or you can set them aside, wash them, dry them, and toast them. Or you can plant them and grow your own pumpkins. For the amount of empanadas we're going to be making today, we're only going to use half of the pumpkin. The other half we're going to set aside and use it for something else. We're going to cut it into smaller pieces and place it in a medium stock pot. This recipe can also be prepared any time of the year using canned pumpkin puree. The cinnamon water has been boiling for a good 15 minutes. Now that it's ready, we're going to pour it directly over the pumpkin in the stock pot, along with the cinnamon and the cloves. Turn on the burner to a low-medium heat, cover it, and let it cook for a good 30 to 40 minutes or until the pumpkin is nice and soft. Once your pumpkin is nice and soft and tender, we're going to remove it from the pot and we're going to let it cool down before we begin the next step. Once your pumpkin is cool enough to handle, using a kitchen spoon, we're going to scrape off the pumpkin from the skin. As we're doing so, we're going to transfer it to a medium saucepan. The amount of pumpkin we used gave us 5 cups of pumpkin puree. Now we're going to add a few more seasonings. I'm going to add half a teaspoon of cinnamon, half a teaspoon of nutmeg. At this point, you can also taste the pumpkin puree to see if it's to your level of sweetness. And if it needs more sweetener, you can add a little bit more brown sugar. We're also going to add 3 tablespoons of butter. We're going to take it over to the stove, place it on medium heat. Move it around to get all those seasonings mixed in with the pumpkin. Once the butter is completely melted, let it simmer for an additional 10 more minutes. Just make sure to move it around often during the process. After 10 minutes, remove it from the burner and let it cool down. If you're using pumpkin puree, you can follow these same steps. For the flour, we're going to need half a teaspoon of cinnamon, half a cup of butter. I'm using unsalted butter, but you can also use the regular butter. 1 large egg, 3/4 of a cup of sugar, 4 cups of all-purpose flour. We're going to start out by adding 1 packet of active dry yeast to half a cup of warm water. We're going to borrow about a tablespoon of the sugar and about 2 tablespoons of the flour. We're going to mix it in with the yeast. Once it's completely dissolved, we're going to cover it with plastic. We're going to set it in a warm, dry place for about 10 to 15 minutes or until it's doubled in size. If your butter is not at room temperature, place it in the microwave for about 15 seconds so it can soften up. Now that the yeast has doubled in size, we can begin to prepare the dough. We're going to start out by adding the dry ingredients to the flour. We're going to add the cinnamon, the sugar, and about 1/4 of a teaspoon of salt. If you're using salted butter, no need to add any additional salt. Give it a good mix, then make a small crater in the middle of the bowl. Add the egg, the butter, and the yeast. Mix in those ingredients first. Once those ingredients are well mixed with the flour, you're going to know how much more water to add. I ended up using 3/4 of a cup of water. That's including the half a cup of water that I used to activate the dry yeast. When adding additional water, you want to make sure the water is nice and warm because that's going to help break down the butter in the flour. The amount of water that you use could vary depending on the brand of flour that you're using or the climate that you live in. So make sure to add additional water a little bit at a time. The total amount of time that I spent kneading the dough was about 7 to 8 minutes. You can also use a stand-up mixer for this step. To make it easier, you can also transfer it to a clean working surface. Once your dough is nice and soft and stretchy and it no longer sticks to your hand, it's ready. Once your dough is ready, you can immediately start to separate it into 2-inch balls of dough. You can also use a kitchen scale to get them to the exact size. I'm just going to eyeball them and separate them as equal as I can. Once we're done separating, we're going to transfer a few back into the bowl and begin to work with the first few. Lightly flour your work surface and begin to roll them out to about 5 to 6 inches. It should have a little bit of thickness to it. It should be somewhere between a gordita and a tortilla. Not too thin like a tortilla, but not as thick as a gordita. Before adding the pumpkin to the empanada, make sure it has completely cooled down. You don't want to add it while it's still hot because it could tear through your empanada. Add a good amount of the pumpkin mixture, but not too much to where you can't close it. Once you have the amount that you want, fold it over. Using your fingers, press down around the edges to seal it. At this point, it could be done, but I like to give it a few extra pinches around the edges just to make sure it doesn't come undone. Once it's well sealed, we're going to transfer it to a lightly greased baking dish. We're going to let it rest for about 20 minutes before we take it to the oven. Preheat your oven to 350 degrees. Before placing the empanadas in the oven, we're going to glaze them with the egg mixture. For the egg glaze, mix 1 egg with a tablespoon of milk and a teaspoon of sugar. Using a basting brush, add a nice even coat to each one of the empanadas. Bake for 20 to 25 minutes or until they're golden brown. And here is the end result. With the amount of ingredients we used, we made a total of 15 large empanadas. To keep your empanadas fresh, store them in an airtight container similar to this one. And enjoy with your favorite coffee, hot chocolate, or a tall glass of cold milk. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in our next video.